I mean, maybe if we could, maybe I could ask the question: how did the church develop from this, living room, family environment where the teaching was interactive? How did it develop from that to what we have today, where we've got church buildings, sermons, pews, etc.? How did we get to that place?
This will take a couple minutes, but let's go ahead and do this, okay? You've got a couple minutes, right, Caleb?
Yeah. All
right, so the part of my mission over the last 40 years is to try to figure out why in the world the New Testament does not use worship terminology to refer to what Christians did when they got together. Why? And so it's clear I can answer that question from the New Testament text. But let's look outside the New Testament. Is it actually still true that worship language is not used to refer to what Christians did in their assemblies after the first century? And it is true. Even in the second century, even in the third century. It's not until the fourth century that this happens. And so part of my research is I'm going through, there's like 2,500 times in the Apostolic Fathers and later Church Fathers that the word worship pops up. 2,500 times. And I'm studying all of them to figure out what's going on there. Are they referring to what Christians are doing in their assembly, or are they referring to something else? But as I went through all this study, I began to notice certain ideas began to pop up that were strange to me, that started to explain why this worship language was not used in reference to what Christians did when they got together. And that is, they were starting to use temple terms. And the first temple term that got to be used to refer to something that was happening in an assembly is the word sacrifice. And you start to see this really early in the beginning of the second century, where some Christian writers, again outside the New Testament, are calling the Lord's Supper our sacrifice that we offer to God. Now, to a typical Protestant mind, we know that's very strange, because we view the Lord's Supper as representing the sacrifice that Jesus gave for us. But now we start to see this idea in the second century where Christians are referring to the Lord's Supper as something, as our sacrifice that we give to God. Bizarre and strange, and it is. And it's not New Testament thinking. It's not Christian thinking. But one thing that starts to happen after that is once the Lord's Supper starts to be viewed as our sacrifice to God, then the table upon which the Lord's Supper sits begins to be viewed as an altar. And altars had no place in the Christian system of the first century. Altars was something that was in the Jewish temple. It was also in pagan temples. It was the thing upon which you offered sacrifices. But Christians don't offer sacrifices, of course. So they have no use for an altar. They don't even have sacred buildings. But now once you start to view the Lord's Supper as our sacrifice to God, then the table upon which it sits becomes an altar. This sacred altar upon which the sacred sacrifice is to be offered. Oh my. Okay, then the next stage of development starts to take place after that, where the person who presides over that table upon which the sacrifice is offered becomes a priest. And this is Old Testament thinking. This is Jewish thinking. This is pagan thinking, because pagans did the same thing in their temples. They had sacrifices. They had altars. They had priests. Jews had sacrifices, altars, and priests. But now the Christians are starting to adopt this Old Testament language to refer to what they're doing in their assemblies. As the Lord's Supper became this sacred big thing, and it also becomes miniaturized, it's no longer this full meal. It's now this sacred little holy Eucharist. And that changed its nature. It's changed how people regarded it, and also changed how we looked at the people who are presiding over this. They're now priests. This is Old Testament language. This is not New Testament language. In the New Testament, we know that priests, well, all of us are priests. We're the holy priesthood. Everybody is. We're all holy, and not just some special few. And then the final fourth step of this four-step process was, if you have a sacrifice, and Christians started to view their Lord's Supper as a sacrifice, and if you have an altar, and if you have a priest who's presiding over that process, then the building in which all this takes place begins to be viewed as a temple. And there is a sermon, there I use the term, preached by Eusebius in the 4th century, around 320 AD, where Constantine had built the Christians this magnificent cathedral. And Eusebius, as a bishop of Caesarea, is given the task of dedicating this marvelous new structure. And he calls it a holy temple of God.
Yeah, wow.
So now the entire process is complete. Christians had reverted to Old Testament thinking of a sacrifice, an altar, a priest, and a temple. And when you have those things, you have the Greek idea and the Old Testament idea of latreia, sacrificing. This was involved, any sacrifice involved a priest and a temple and a sacrifice and a temple. So you've got all these things together with the concept of latreia. And from there, Christianity continued on with priestly ideas in reference to their special clergy, with referring to the Lord's Supper in special terms that it didn't have in the 1st century, and the altar concept and the idea of the church building as a holy place. Some of these ideas are not just in Catholicism or in Orthodox Christianity. They are there also in a lot of Protestant thinking as well. So the worship idea is still there because of all those things. What'd you say there? Say it again.
We have altar calls. You know, they say, welcome to the house of God, as if that house is the temple, of God where God dwells. Yeah, we have all that language. Yeah, it's very much the same. And then the person at the front is like a sacred, revered person who supposedly is closer to God than what we are. So he kind of like is a little bit closer to God than us, just like the priest was an intermediary. It's almost a little bit like that as well. God speaks to him in a special way. Sometimes on the stage you say, what was that, God? Yeah. So, yeah, definitely.
No, but the idea in the New Testament, we're all the holy ones. We're all saints. We're all priests. Nobody's more special than anybody else. All of us are endowed with the Spirit of God. All of us have something to offer to build up one another. But the modern church system has squelched everybody except for the few that we pay to do it, and they take care of the teaching process at the front. And that's fine. I was that guy, and I learned a lot by being forced to study for 10 hours every week and come up with something to say. But nobody else got the opportunity to study and to come up with something to say. And there could have been hundreds of people in my audiences over the years who could have developed into to teachers, pastors, leaders in various ways, but they never got the opportunity because our system won't let them.